Okay, welcome everyone. It's the sixth and final session of the lecture series of the seminar series Agency, Architecture in the Civil Service. And basically, so what we did here is question architecture's role in the public sector, very broadly speaking. And we had for this 6 interventions. The first one was by Eva Kukic and also by the Ampli für Städtebau, who showed through more bottom-up approaches how the architect's role could be redefined and can be redefined. Then in the second seminar we had Elena Axiotti, who showed suggested and showed us the historical transformation of the architect's role in the UK, also especially from a more economic perspective, how the role has kind of defunded the primary role and the agency of the architect in it. And then we had a more concrete example, a much more here from Zurich, the Gruppe für Expressprojekte, where we had a look at how the city of Zurich has a special unit to advance particular projects, followed by a look into Berlin, where we had Rebecca Wall and Felix Marlow on public civic partnerships, where they showed while looking at specific examples, how there's this kind of new practice around involving publics and the civics in architecture projects. Last week we had Markus Miesen from the University of Luxembourg, who discussed with us the assemblies, and today, and I will come to that, no, I forgot to show this kind of diagram where we somehow try to make sense of the different interventions. Nevertheless, I think I will skip this because today we have with us Finn Williams, who sits right next to me, and I will read because I cannot remember the bios by heart. So Finn Williams is the city architect of Malmö, and he previously worked to advance public architecture and planning in the UK through different roles. One was at Creighton Council, the Greater London Authority, and as a co-founder and CEO of Public Practice. He's also a visiting professor at UCL's Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, and was co-curator of the British Pavilion at the 2016 Architecture Biennale. And also in 2023, Tidskrift and Room named him the most influential figure in architecture and design in Sweden. Well, we invited Phil Williams because we think he brings a unique perspective on embedding architectural thinking in public institutions, and we also think that his work exemplifies how architects can act as agents of systems change and within the civil service, making him a highly relevant intervention for lecture, for part of this lecture. So we are very happy to have him here with us. And before I hand over the stage to him, I think Jakob also wants to present our respondents.
Yeah, I have now the pleasure to introduce our 3 now respondents. It's very high caliber one, I think, because we have Regula Lüscher here, who's actually all 3 of us, all 3 of the respondents are trained architects here in Zurich. So is Regula Lüscher. After working setting up her own practice, she joined the Amt für Städtebau and also became the vice director of the Department of Städtebau. And then most prominent, at least for me, probably having lived in Berlin, is she got appointed, I don't know how, the translation is always a bit, Director of Architecture and State Secretary of Urban Development by the Senate of Berlin. I think it's kind of a English translation of the title, so Senatsbaudirektorin, which is a big thing in Berlin, and it's something similar than a city architect. I'm never so sure what the exact term is, but I would say so. And under her direction, maybe in Berlin, the projects like the Haus der Statistik we heard before about, and also Rathausblock we heard 2 weeks about, got into place. So you're also it stands in this room. After she retreated from this position in 2021, she became now back at a freelancer and also started teaching here again last year. Then we have Leonie Müller, who is also a trained architect here. She joined the Amt für Hochbauten a few years after her graduation, and is a project leader in the Department of Building, and so she is developing competitions. So she's part of she's essentially also developing tools, strategic tools for as an architect civil servant for the public, which I think that's why we invited her to have a bit to introduce also this the tool of the competition, of the Swiss competition. No, that is very that we are proud of, I guess. And to go along with that, I also invited Tamino Kuni, who you might have seen before, also a trained architect, and he worked as an editor for the Hochparterre for the competition issue of the Hochparterre, and is also part of ZAS. But now he's a doctoral candidate and researching at the GTA architecture competitions in Zurich and how they've been instrumentalized in political economy. And I think this is kind of the Zurich setup, and I think it relates very much to your work, no? And with this, I move to your PowerPoint. Yes.
Great. Thank you so much. Excellent to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I only wish I could have been here for all the other talks, which sound fascinating. Might have made mine a bit more intelligent if I'd been able to hear them all in advance. It's also fantastic that you've brought together such a knowledgeable but also slightly intimidating set of respondents. So I'm very much looking forward to the conversation afterwards. I've got a huge amount of slides to run through, so I'm going to jump straight into them. So I'm going to talk about my practice in Malmö, but also refer back to work that I've done in London, which has taught me something about the dynamics of how to work from within City Hall as an architect, or within a City Hall as an architect with a wider set of interests and perspectives. As we're an architecture school, I thought I'd go back to my kind of perceptions of architecture when I left school and started working in the private sector, and then the reality that I was met when I started in practice, that the vast majority of what I ended up spending my time doing, and my also that we as architects put our energy into, seemed to be something else than what I was taught, something that seemed on the face of it to be bureaucracy. And in the UK, that took the form of a whole series of layers of decision-making and politics and practice that I simply hadn't been exposed to before. Everything from national policy and legislation through to strategic planning, how land is assembled and allocated, development economics, surveying, engineering, procurement, commissioning, and only then it felt like architecture came into that process. And everything that I'd spent my education thinking about, learning about, felt like a very small fragment of a much more complex and longer chain. And I was very conscious, qualified in London, that there was no shortage of very talented architects, more talented architects than me. But what it felt, if there was one reason why the built environment didn't live up to the talent and quality of architects in the city, it was about many of the decisions that were made earlier upstream, and the lack of spatial expertise and design expertise that went into making those decisions. So I decided back then, and this was about 2008, to attempt to swim upstream and go into the public sector and work with many of those earlier steps. That was quite an unusual step to take at the time. And we're talking 2008 at a time when a very small proportion of architects actually worked in the public sector. If you go back as far as 1976, half of all architects in the UK worked in the public sector. And that was a time also when the public sector built approximately half of all new homes in the UK. At that time, in the 1970s, there were even things called city architects in Britain. And this is the timeline of when city architects died out in various cities across the UK, and no doubt also chimes with what we've heard a bit from Eleni Axiotti earlier in the lecture series. The last city architect in England retired in 2010, John Thorpe in Leeds, and at that point the role of the city architect became extinct. I was lucky enough to practice in a number of different roles within public administrations in the UK, as urban designer, as a kind of area manager, regeneration practitioner, but it wasn't until I moved to Sweden that I got to practice as a city architect. There are about 150 different city architects in Sweden, and Malmö has had a city architect since 1822, William Klein. I became the 10th city architect in Malmö. Not particularly representative or diverse bunch here. We had one woman in the early 2000s, but what has changed in that time has been the role of the city architect, from someone who designs and draws public buildings to actually more of an administrative manager who looks after planning applications, to my role when I was given the license to redesign the job description, because they divided up the job and made sure they appointed a proper manager to manage departments, and then the question was left open: what can a city architect in Malmö do? That was 4 years ago, and since then I've been trying to redefine how a city architect can work within an administration like Malmö, and I found this actually Danish tool very useful. It's called the Danish Design Ladder, and it talks about the role of design within an organisation and how you can have different levels of influence. And I'm going to use this to structure my talk and work our way up the ladder bit by bit. So the first step of the ladder is business as usual, and that really is when you're not doing anything in the city. So I'm going to take this step to describe what the kind of status quo is, the current situation in Malmö, both the advantages we have as a city, but also the challenges we face, which I think are common for many other cities in Sweden and possibly beyond. So Malmö has a reputation of being a pioneer in sustainable urban development. Certainly since the early 2000s, we've had some really groundbreaking projects in a Scandinavian context, like Bornollet, the housing expo, which people still 25 years later come to visit as an example of what a sustainable urban neighbourhood can look like. We have a politics that's extremely progressive, that wants to be bold, to experiment, to really push the envelope in terms of particularly environmental sustainability and increasingly social sustainability. But at the same time, of course, development in itself isn't necessarily what we need to be looking for if we're looking to radically reduce our impact on the climate. And much of our work to do with sustainability up until this point has been around driving down the embodied carbon of and operational carbon of new build. But we're obviously all in a totally new paradigm of how we can think, at least in relation to my career, how we can think differently about whether we need to develop at all and what we can keep and reuse. Malmö has a reputation of having a very dynamic, fast-growing creative economy. It's the fastest growing jobs market of any big city in Sweden. We've got things like one of the biggest games and digital industry. The creative industry is actually our biggest in the city. At the same time, we have a reputation of being a city with huge socioeconomic divides and inequalities, by many measures the worst of any city in Scandinavia. So how do we also not just grow our economy, but also grow socioeconomic justice across the city and break down many of those barriers to spatial integration that exist in the city as a whole? This is where I go, back to my flat in Rosengård, and Rosengård has a reputation of being one of the worst social housing, or the most deprived social housing areas in the city, depending on whose perspective you're looking at it from. And here is the barrier where the one of many physical and psychological barriers that exist in the city is where you're not allowed to take your scooters, because Rosengård is the only area in the inner ring road in Malmö where you're not allowed to take. The geofencing prevents you from taking scooters. Malmö is a super diverse city, so 370,000 people, 186 different nationalities. 56% of the population has a foreign background, which actually places me in a majority. And that makes it, for me, a city that is very exciting to live in, has incredibly rich cultural life. But how far does our built environment, both existing and new, reflect that cultural diversity? And there's a long way to go to be able to realise the huge advantage we have with our diversity as a city in our built environment. So if those are kind of three of the big questions that we grapple with as a city on a day-to-day basis, the first step in the ladder about how you can use design to tackle those questions is aesthetics. And that's about things like, the kind of superficial layer of building, architecture, public realm. And much of our time as a planning department is spent making schemes like this fit in a bit better, particularly if it's in a historic context. We've all been part of processes like this where you take more care of the context, you try and show respect, understand, and analyse the surroundings, and then develop a scheme that might fit slightly better in whatever the constraints of the client or their architects. But I think where we struggle as a city and even as a country in Sweden is taking that kind of more careful approach to context in any area of the city. So this is again Rosengård, where I live, and this is the kind of new housing that we've been building in Sweden's equivalent of social housing areas. Is measurably worse in almost every dimension than housing that was built in the 70s that many people look down on, but is in fact has a huge amount of qualities. This new housing has more to do with the factories where it was prefabricated than the place where it is. It's kind of bolted on balconies, small mean windows, small flat sizes, cheap materials that are already starting to look bad after about 6 years, terrible public realm, and this, until recently, has been good enough because we're lucky if we get anyone to build in these kind of areas. So when we're talking about aesthetics in relation to spatial inequality or spatial justice, then it does play an important role symbolically to try and make sure we establish what we call an equality of quality across the city. That means showing every area respect, not just the historic core, but even our social housing areas, and make sure that the new housing we design enters into a positive dialogue with its neighbours that says to the people who live here, I see value in what's already there, and I'm going to reflect that and build with that value when I build something new in the area. We also, as a public authority, obviously place that care in our public buildings and make sure that when we're building, for example, a new library in Rosengård here, this is actually where we invest the most. to try and rebalance the inequalities of quality that exist across the city. We can set the bar in terms of what we expect, but and then use that as a way of leveraging better quality from the market. So when we say an equality of quality, we mean development or architecture that is just as good, but not just the same in different areas, and that's critical, and I'll come back to that later. I want to jump back to something that I worked on in London to talk about some of the shortcomings of aesthetics and ultimately explain why it sits quite low down in this ladder. So when I worked in London, I was responsible for regeneration across northwest and central London, and we initially, in our work with high streets, town centres in London, put a lot of emphasis on the design of the kind of public welcome of a high street, what you see first, the shop fronts, the signage, the street lighting, and did some beautiful projects that we put a lot of care into. A lot of them were actually around shopfront improvement. So we took, for example, this old scrubby shopfront, and then we brought in like the coolest, youngest architects and graphic designers to improve those shopfronts and make them look kind of hipsterify them, right? And one of the problems with this is these like local corner shops, or often quite down to earth, simple businesses on high streets, suddenly all look like hipster coffee bars and scared away their normal clientele, and kind of ended up with lots of young designers knocking on the door looking for something cool and being surprised when they found something totally different inside. And I revisited a lot of these on Google Earth recently and found what they've been turned into. So this is the same shop now, Best Kebab. I quite like the Best Kebab sign. But
how many years later?
I would say this is probably 2012, 14, 15, 20, 21. I mean, if there's anything you can be sure of in London's high streets, it's that they change. And we'd invested huge amounts of money in improving these shop fronts. This was another nice new scheme we did in Cricklewood. This is it today. So we learned that kind of dealing with the aesthetics of shop fronts wasn't the solution. What we needed to do is change the conditions for how shop fronts are designed, what shop fronts businesses commission, and go behind the shop fronts to speak to the people who run the shops and support them as businesses, train them up as businesses to understand how they communicate with their clientele, but also how they address the street. Which takes me to the kind of next step, because by that point we're already starting to work with processes, not just the aesthetics of one-off shop fronts. And that is the next step on the ladder, is process, and that means things like, for example, in my world, the process of how we do planning approvals, or the process of how development works. I talked before about how little Malmö's contemporary development reflects the diversity of our city, and that's true across Sweden. So this is a snapshot of a number of housing projects from across Sweden over the last few years. And I usually use this slide to test developers and architects and ask them which one of these projects, and there's only one, was built in Malmö. And I'm not going to force you to guess, because but often it's the actual developers who are responsible for some of these projects, and they don't even recognise where they are. So this is where they all are, all over the country. And this is of course slightly unfair. Not all housing in Sweden is kind of brick red, rusty brown, but there's equally generic development of other kinds in Sweden. And this kind of lack of rootedness in place has actually generated a huge political reaction, a kind of ground surge of dissatisfaction from community groups, politicians, particularly on the right wing, who are kind of sick and tired of what they call kind of boxy development, generic boxy development. And they want to, they're arguing very strongly for returning to more traditional architecture. And this is the kind of traditional architecture we had in Skåne, in southern Sweden, in Malmö, about 300, 400 years ago. And you can kind of understand the critique of the problem with contemporary development, you can kind of understand that they want to wind the clock back to a time when architecture had a more of a direct relationship with place. In this case, the bricks were from the clay under our feet in Malmö. They were bound together with lime from the local lime quarry. The steep roof and courtyard forms are connected to the local climate, which has a kind of infamous wind and rain coming in off the Öresund, and a lot of the crafts and detailing are inherited from a trade in skills and expertise across southern Sweden, but actually also with Denmark and Northern Europe and the Hanseatic League at that time, 300, 400 years ago. So this was an architecture that was rooted in the very specific local conditions that it had, and as a result, looked very different from architecture in the northern Sweden or eastern Sweden. But if we try and recreate that architecture now, it's just as irrelevant to Malmö as a place today as those original red brick looking gable projects that I showed before, because we've got a totally different set of local conditions today in Malmö. We need, in terms of resources, we need to be using circular resources, bio-based, low carbon. Some of those materials we were using 300, 400 years ago, but not all of them, and we need to use them differently. Our climate is changing rapidly, and Malmö is particularly exposed to climate being a very flat city on the coast. Our architecture also needs to respond in its form to that. And our culture is totally different from 300 and 400 years ago. We've got this incredibly diverse population. How can our architecture make the most of that incredible breadth of expertise and backgrounds, but also the kind of new possibilities for new ideas and innovations that come when people from many different backgrounds meet? We see that in our food culture in Malmö. Malmö's got an incredible, we're very proud that our kind of national dish in Malmö is the falafel, but there's lots of very unique variations on the falafel. We hear it in Malmö's music, like incredible mix of new music that's coming out, particularly urban music coming out of Malmö. We see it in many forms of visual art, but we don't see it in our architecture yet. So we're now in the process of publishing a new, kind of process guidelines for how we can build more place-based. And we're going to be launching these for public engagement and consultation after the summer. And what we've tried to do is break down the different dimensions of what makes a project place-based and explain that in detail and set out a process to force architects and their developers to really engage with what makes a place unique and respond to that. And to summarize incredibly quickly and crudely, those are dimensions from kind of how you access and use and learn from local knowledge, how you work with existing local structures, how you understand and meet very specific local needs, how you respond to local microclimate and ecology, how you use local resources and the first resources close to hand, and how you formally respond to local character. And we're very conscious that place obviously exists at many different scales. So this isn't just about how you respond to, for example, the resources that are in your site or around your site. It's also about resources that are available at the bioregional scale. And we're also very conscious that working in a place-based way does not mean that all development in Malmö is going to look one way. One of the defining features of Malmö is its, what you say in Swedish, is brokighet, which is almost untranslatable. It's masked here by this map, but it means kind of jumbledness or mixed upness or chaotic kind of messiness. And that's something that we're proud of in Malmö and something that we want to work with and exacerbate and celebrate. And so we've developed this process now to make sure that all developments go through it so that they can be better anchored in their place. And just to give you one example of what that looks like, I'm very conscious that, you might think that that's going to suddenly make everything look exactly the same as its neighbour. It's not even necessarily about form in many cases. So this is Sofielund, a very central industrial area in Malmö that was originally earmarked for redevelopment as housing-led development in about 2018-19. And the process that we're talking about means really understanding and mapping and analysing and learning from that, what's already there in that place. And in this case, that meant lifting all the roller shutters to the industrial sheds, speaking to the businesses that were behind there, and we found this incredible, this was before my time, but we found this incredible range of everyone from kombucha breweries to martial arts clubs to mosques to bakava bakeries to roller derby, the third best roller derby team in the world, to climbing centres, to circus schools, to big bread bakeries and mechanics and nightclubs and rehearsal rooms. And one of the things that they all had in common was the need to make noise. And this was the thing that was threatened most by housing-led development. So when we mapped them all and spoken to them and discussed what this plan really might mean for their businesses and the future of the area, we realised that the last thing that this place needed was housing-led redevelopment. If we were really working in a place-based way, that meant understanding that policy itself had to reflect the local economy of that place and the local cultural life. So we designated Sophia Lund as a cultural sound zone. That means we used environmental legislation to protect those organisations' right to make noise, and in doing so, preventing housing redevelopment. So from what I see, a kind of extremely place-based policy. And now this area has developed into an incredible mix and is in the process of developing into an incredible mix of immigrant-run local businesses that temporarily often transform into performance venues, and once a year run an amazing music festival where bands and stages take over all the tyre hotels and mechanic bays. And if any of you are interested in visiting Malmö, I definitely recommend coming at the beginning of August and coming for NGBG Gatufest. So these processes can help us land in better responses to a particular problem, but I suppose even more important than a process is kind of why you're doing something in the first place, where you're directing your energies, and particularly as a city, where we're doing things like, well, what areas are we redeveloping? Where are we placing public investment? This was a question I worked with a lot in London, to jump back to London again, where we had a kind of, when I joined the team, we'd had this track record of working with big set-piece regeneration projects that would take a particular area and kind of rethink it and put large amounts of public funding to transform the area. So this was a kind of a visualization of what this area in Hackney Wick would look like as a new fashion hub. David Adjaye designed it, and this is what it ended up looking like. And these projects were often more successful actually at generating local engagement just by getting people angry about the fact we were doing them. So they had this actually incredible byproduct or kind of side effect of mobilizing local people, usually against something that we were proposing, that was obviously problematic for a bit, but sometimes reached this moment of alchemy when the local group of opposition actually wanted to do something else that was much better than what we thought of, and kind of led the development of the area in a different direction. Obviously it was too late for Hackney Wick, but when I was having to deal with these big lumps of money and think about what we should do with them, I couldn't help thinking maybe we should divide it up into small amounts of money and then give it to communities and ask them what they would do in their area rather than us trying to second guess them and getting it wrong. So we run a program, and this was back in the days when crowdfunding was a big thing for kind of watches and drinks coolers, and we ran one of the kind of early urban crowdfunding programs to ask community groups what they would like in their area. They formulated the ideas, we gave them capacity building and support, and managed the process so it would be democratically accountable, and then saw what came through, and then allocated public funding for them up to 50% of their match funding, up to £50,000 per project. And we did that over about, I think it was about 4 to 5 years we ran that program. And an extraordinary array of proposals came through from all over London. These are the ones that got realised. in the first phase of this program, 130 different projects, over 20,000 people, local businesses, local residents, local local authorities as well, then pledged money in return and engaged an incredible breadth and diversity of people in making those projects happen that built local capacity in a really exciting way. And I'm not going to go into what all those different projects are now, but this is mainly a kind of a learning about establishing a platform for other people's ideas was actually where the design was in this process, and it's something that I've certainly realised had a kind of a value way beyond each of these individual projects, because each of these groups are now going on to doing more projects themselves, and they've built a huge amount of resilience and local knowledge in the process. So in Malmö, we're I suppose asking the same question. Where are there existing initiatives? Where are there ideas from the community, and how might we learn from them in terms of how the city develops? So we've been running a program, ran it for the first time in 2023, a kind of festival of civic urbanism called Malmö in the Making, where in 2023 we had 128 different activities across the city. And this is all in Swedish, but you get an idea of the range of events that there were. They were all initiated by the crowd, by Malmö's civic and kind of cultural sector, and they were all about helping Malmö citizens engage with and influence the city's development. It was a huge success. It was also a huge amount of work, so we needed a 2-year kind of break to get over it, but we're running it again this September. So again, that would be a good time to come and visit Malmö, because there'll be a lot happening across the city. So this is a way of us kind of plugging into, opening up, creating a platform where we can open up and listen to a much more plural, diverse set of ideas about what might happen in the city, and then learning from it in our work and building it into our day-to-day work. But so we can have a strategy, but and we can point in the right way, but still change can then come up and meet the barrier of systems that perhaps aren't open to different ways of working, or systems that are already very well established and good at doing something totally different. And in terms of urban development, the kind of systems we're talking about here are who builds, what does the development look like, but also about the systems and structure of the architecture industry. And as a city, we have tools to influence that. So it may not be our planning applications and how we detail plan different areas, but there are other tools that exist in other departments that can have a huge influence to bring around systemic change. Jumping back to London again briefly, in terms of who builds in the city, this was a major issue in London because the number of small builders had halved in the country as a whole over the previous 10 years when I was working at City Hall, and that was equally true of London, and yet the capacity for new housing in the city was a lot of the time on small sites that the big developers weren't interested in. So again, we took this same kind of approach that we'd done with the crowdfund London programme, and set up a platform that made it easy for my colleagues who were sitting on all of these small plots of land, like scraps of land beside railway stations or old garages that the council wasn't using anymore, and open them up specifically for small builders, community-led groups and architect developers. So architects turned developers. And by creating a platform, we were able to do that really efficiently. So there was a lot of resistance to working with these small-scale sites from property departments because it was too much work. It was easier for them to just concentrate on the big sites and sell them, because the legals were equally difficult if it was small or a big site. But by packaging it up and running it as a program, we were able to find a kind of efficiency of scale that meant that we were able to get small sites out to smaller developers much quicker, and saw some really amazing projects emerge as a result of this. So this is Peter Barber in a kind of sliver of land beside the North Circular, which no one thought was developable before, and he managed to get an extraordinary number of homes, but also create a really high quality place. And that's just one example of a whole load of different small sites that are currently in the process of being developed. And that obviously has a capacity building effect on the small builder sector in itself. It invites new small builders in, they challenge the bigger players, and that in turn changes the dynamics of the system. And that's exactly the kind of change we're hoping to bring about in Malmö now. So we've managed to get a political commission from 2 different political committees to support Malmö's small building sector. The vast majority of what's built in Sweden is built by a very small number of very large organisations. You've sure heard of Peab and Skanska. But when we see small builders build in Malmö, and these are actually all architect developers and a co-housing group, the difference in quality but also in sustainability is very obvious. So we're now looking at running something similar, a kind of program to really support a wider range of small builders to develop kind of leasehold on public land. That's also something we're doing with competitions, and it feels like we might have a conversation about competitions afterwards, given the expertise in the room. So I'm not going to go into this in a lot of detail, but I think it's fair to say that the composition of Sweden's architecture industry kind of mirrors the composition of the development sector, which is quite top heavy. A small number of very large firms who do a lot of the work, and we're conscious that we want to access the architecture practices that are in the right stage of their development for every project, and access the expertise that's going to deliver that project best, whether it's from Malmö or elsewhere, whether it's big or whether it's small. So competitions have been done in a relatively ad hoc way previously, but we've now set up a system for competitions where we've set very low thresholds. We run everything open through an open pre-qualification, and then we select 3 to 5 practices and give them kind of proportionate remuneration to develop a project, and then choose a scheme based on that project. And just to give you an example of kind of the difference it makes, this is the kind of housing we were building for like sheltered housing or people with severe disabilities before. It was all designed around how to minimize the kind of efforts from the people running the centre and the costs from the people running these facilities, and not at all designed from the perspective of residents or even neighbours. But through a competition we were able to land in a totally different typology of sheltered housing that learns from the kind of inherent wisdoms of local Skånsk, southern Swedish development. And we've been running other competitions about how to integrate existing buildings with a new university building here, how to rethink our car parks so that they're not just car parks that then have to be demolished when the need for cars changes, but they can also be dismantled and turned into something else. And taking the same approach with actually other kinds of public infrastructure, small little buildings that nevertheless play an important role in the city, like this pumping station. It's bang in the middle of a big new development area. Norrell Rode, small architecture practices, have won this project, designing a building that can be converted into a public building once the pumping station moves, which is a longer term plan in about 20 to 30 years. So the working systemically with things like commissioning, but also with how we sell land, is a way of also altering the structure of the architecture industry and the development industry, about supporting them to diversify and supporting smaller players to challenge some of the big players and compete with them. And but even more important than working systemically or structurally is the last step of this process, and that's about working with culture. As Peter Drucker says, culture eats strategy for breakfast, and that's about what lasts in an organisation. This kind of incredibly difficult things to change. So if changing systems, like if changing the development system or the architecture system in Sweden is hard, changing culture is even harder. But that's about who we are, how we work, what values we have, what experiences we take with us. That was a question that I asked again, back in the UK, having worked at City Hall, because it felt like the main barrier to good urban development and good urbanism in London was not a lack of good policies. It was actually I'd seen that good people can work around bad policies, but good policies can't work around the lack of good people in the role. So it was really a question of what kind of cultures, what capacities exist within local authorities and how we could change that. So with a colleague at City Hall, Pooja, we came up with the idea of starting a not-for-profit social enterprise called Plureaucracy that would recruit all kinds of different built environment experts, a lot of them architects, but also people with a background in engineering, development, sustainability, community engagement, nearly all from the private sector, about 93% were from outside the public sector, and place them inside local authorities in roles of up to 1 year and in cohorts of up to 30 people. And I can explain this in a bit more detail if anyone's interested, but I'm racing through it. So what over the last 5 to 6 years, public practice has placed probably nearly 500 people now in probably nearly 150 to 200 different local authorities across the UK. To put that into perspective, back in the 50s and 60s, the LCC was the largest architecture practice in the world. The London County Council Architects Department was the largest architecture practice in the world with about 250, 300 people. Public practice has placed, I mean, they're not all architects, but 400 people into public service. And over 90% of those people are staying on after the first year and still working in the public sector. The model, when I ran it for the first 3 years, was that you have an induction course as a cohort, and then you work in your role for the first 12 months. And in that 12 months, every other Friday, you meet up as a cohort and you learn from each other. But you don't just learn from each other and support each other, you produce practical research. So these were all like super pragmatic stuff around working with net zero or community engagement. And it wasn't theoretical research, it was like hands-on toolkits, guidance, checklists, stuff that you could use. Because we were recruiting at scale, and we were doing this with so many people, we were able to really work hard on equality, diversity and inclusion, which Donald Trump probably wouldn't like much. But it had a huge impact on the kind of breadth of perspectives and expertise and lived experiences we were able to bring on the programme. And one of the most impactful things was when we were able to place really talented practitioners back in the communities they grew up in. Selassie Situfe, having worked as an architect, went back to Barking to work with her community for her local authority. Mark Warren went back to Merton. Arnon Nori went back to Enfield. Akil Smith went back to Croydon. In fact, he's still,
Sorry, just a question. When you say you're placing them,
Yeah.
what does it actually mean? Like,
Yeah, I realise I'm rushing through all of this and not explaining it well. So the way it worked is we ran a recruitment round for each cohort once every 6 months. We got in sometimes 300, 200, 300, 400 applications. And then they would go through an incredibly exacting, thorough recruitment process. Which I would never have got through myself if I'd had to do that when I joined the public sector. At the same time, we actually made local authorities compete to host placements, and we designed really good roles, so minimum 12 months roles, nearly always doing something that hadn't been done before, like a new kind of expertise or a new kind of thing.
Architecture and planning, or
Yeah, architecture and planning and urbanism. And then what we did is we had the roles, we had the candidates who'd gone through our recruitment process, got down to about 60 and 30 roles, and then we matched them. So we'd say, right, you're matched with a role in Havering, developing a new programme of council housing. And then you could reject it if you wanted, but a lot of people accepted it. And then you'd have that minimum 12 months, see what it's like, and if you liked it, you could stay on. So that's how the programme worked. So it's now having systemic change, but it's also changing the culture of what it is to work in the public sector and what it's like to be an architect in that context. And I just want to end, and I'm aware of time, I want to end with this example now, which is kind of having been through this whole process, when I landed in Croydon. So I'd read a lot about Croydon being a super diverse city, 186 different nationalities. But this was one of the first things I saw actually when I came to Croydon. It was this sign saying, together we're building Embassy of Sharing. It's a bit unfair to single out just this development and just this developer, because to be fair, it could have been any in the whole of Malmö. You know, bang in the middle of one of the most diverse areas, one of the most diverse cities in Europe, a sign that just didn't reflect the diversity of the area in any way. Now, we work really hard, and we have been working over the last few years really hard to kind of compensate for the lack of diversity around the table when we're making decisions by doing lots of community participation, particularly with young people. We do things like we've got a system where young people, rather than me show people around an area and say what needs to change, we train up young people so that they can become urban guides to show me and my colleagues and politicians around those areas and help us learn about the areas. But that's only a kind of sticking plaster on a more fundamental lack of perspectives and understanding around the table from the side of local authorities, because it certainly felt for me like within City Hall, within the profession, we were missing a lot of perspectives from areas where we were actually working and needing to make some quite important decisions. I had a whole load of conversations with really brilliant young people who were already established architects who'd moved to Sweden recently, who were training as architects or planners or engineers, or who wanted to become architects and engineers, and started to understand more about the barriers that existed for them coming into the profession. We got some funding, and for the first time we were able to actually get some statistics on how representative Malmö's architecture industry is. No one could tell us, apart from gender, up until that point. But now, for the first time, we got statistics on how representative it is from everything from sexuality to disability to ethnicity to religion. We came up collectively through a process with about 850 people over a course of about a year, with a whole series of recommendations. We also ran a number of pilot projects with architects here, Haidar going back to the area where he grew up as a young boy, recently emigrated from Iraq, and going back and meeting kids and telling them about architecture and what it is to be an architect. One of a number of initiatives we run, and we launched a report to show what the issues were, where the gaps were, and what we might be able to do about it as an industry. And we've been talking about it across the country since then. And in February, we established Urban Academy, as we're calling it, as a social enterprise, or like a charity or not-for-profit organisation, where we've got over 30 organisations now, from developers to politicians to community groups to architecture offices, who've all signed up to a collective commitment to make Malmö's architecture industry and development industry reflect the diversity of the people we serve within a generation. And there's a whole series of commitments that go with that, and we're in the process of starting what is a huge piece of work right now. But it's already influencing what's happening in the city. I think a lot of those organisations they've committed to drive individual activities and kind of measures to improve access to the industry and also education, recruitment and leadership. And it feels like it's starting to open up a different kind of dialogue about what kind of Malmö we have. It's starting to build a different culture within the industry and a different culture within the city. And that's what I mean by cultural change. So, in a typical week, we're working at every single one of these levels. It's a lot harder working at the top end. It takes a lot more time and resources. Of course, I'm still commenting on facades, trying to make them look nicer. But I think I keep on coming back to this as a way of reminding myself that we need to be working at all those levels and not just one or the other. And I think in that way, hopefully we can get to a point where, I'm very conscious that if you think back to those slides of the kind of single male white city architect, that was the model we had in the UK. And those individuals, some of them were incredible, inspired, fantastic. Other ones, perhaps less so. and they had a huge amount of power and influenced the city for better or worse. But because they were individuals, it also made it very easy to get rid of them. They did amazing things in those roles, but also they left very little legacy. And I'm conscious that as long as we have the idea of a city architect, there's the possibility that that city architect might get hit by a bus or might get cut by the next political administration that comes in. And what's left then? And I think these steps of the ladder are an important reminder that the city architect's job can't just be down to one person. To do the job well, it needs to be about bringing in a much greater plurality of perspectives, expertise, voices, and capacities. And that's what we're trying to do in Malmö. So we're going from a city architect to a city of architects. Thanks.